there is a moment Kevin has returned to again and again in the quiet hours after everything ended. It was a Tuesday evening. Julia was laughing at something on her phone, and when he asked what was funny, she said, "Nothing, just work stuff," and turned the screen away. He nodded. He believed her. What he didn't know then, what would take him months to understand, was that the laugh she gave him that night was the same one she would give him the day he asked her to choose. Light, unbothered. As if his pain was a minor inconvenience she could scroll past. This is the story of Kevin Aldridge and his wife Julia Aldridge, née Morel. They had been married for 6 years when the story you're about to hear took place. 6 years of shared routines and inside jokes, of arguments about small things and silences that sometimes said more than words. Kevin was the kind of man who loved deeply and quietly, who showed his feelings through consistency rather than grand gestures. Julia was warmer on the surface, more social, more electric in a room. They had been drawn together by exactly that contrast, and for years it had worked. But somewhere along the way, something had quietly shifted inside their marriage. Not broken, not shattered, just tilted. And like most tilted things, it took a long time before anyone noticed how far it had leaned. Kevin and Julia's mornings had a rhythm to them. She would wake up first, always. By the time Kevin came downstairs, the coffee was already made. Not because she planned it that way, but because it had simply become what she did. He would pour himself a cup, sit across from her at the kitchen table, and they would talk. Not about anything important, usually. The weather. What was on television the night before, whether the neighbor's dog had been barking again. Small things. Comfortable things. And Kevin loved those mornings. He genuinely did. There was something about the ordinariness of them that felt like proof. Proof that the life they had built was real and solid and worth protecting. They lived in a 2-story house in a quiet part of the city. Kevin worked in civil engineering, a job that required precision and patience, 2 qualities he had in abundance. Julia worked in marketing for a mid-size firm downtown. She had been promoted twice in the past 3 years, and Kevin had been proud of her each time. He told her so. He meant it. They didn't have children yet. It was something they talked about in the abstract. Someday, they both said, without either of them pressing too hard on when. Kevin had started to want it more concretely in the past year or so. Julia seemed content to let the idea stay soft and undefined. He didn't push. He thought they had time. It was around November of that year that Kevin first met Daniel Fitch. Julia mentioned him casually one evening. A new senior account manager who had joined her team. She said he was funny, that he'd completely changed the atmosphere in the office. Kevin listened, nodded, asked a few polite questions. There was nothing in the way she talked about Daniel that set off any kind of alarm. She mentioned him the same way she mentioned anyone from work, a character in a story Kevin wasn't part of. Over the following weeks, Daniel came up more often. A joke he'd made in a meeting, a lunch the team had shared where Daniel had ordered something ridiculous and laughed at himself about it. Kevin absorbed these mentions without attaching much weight to them. He trusted Julia. He had always trusted Julia. But there was a night in early December, a Friday, Kevin remembered this clearly, when Julia came home later than expected. She had texted to say the team was wrapping up a pitch deck and she'd be home by 8. She walked in closer to 10, her cheeks still flushed from the cold outside, her energy lighter and more animated than he'd seen in a while. "Good night?" Kevin asked. "Really good, actually," she said, dropping her bag and kicking off her shoes. "We finished the deck and then a few of us went for drinks. I didn't think we'd stay as long as we did." "A few of you," Kevin said. Daniel organized it. He's really good at pulling people together." Kevin said nothing. He handed her a plate of the dinner he'd kept warm for her. She thanked him, sat down, picked up her fork, and spent the next 20 minutes telling him about the pitch. He listened. He smiled when she smiled, but somewhere in the back of his mind, very quietly, something had shifted, like a door that wasn't quite closed all the way, letting in just the smallest draft of cold air. He didn't say anything about it, not that night, Not yet. January arrived and Kevin began paying attention differently, not obsessively. He wasn't the kind of man who went through phones or followed people, but he was observant by nature. It came with his work, this habit of noticing when things weren't aligned. And slowly, carefully, he started to notice things. Julia's phone was face down more often than it used to be. She had always been casual about it before, leaving it on the counter, face up, charging in the kitchen where anyone might glance at the screen. Now it traveled with her, to the bathroom, to the bedroom. Even just moving room to room in the house, the phone came along. He noticed that when it buzzed in the evenings, she would check it quickly and then smile before putting it away. The kind of smile you try to suppress. The kind that belongs to something private. He noticed that she had started mentioning Daniel less. Not more, less. As if she had become aware of how often the name had appeared and had consciously dialed it back. To Kevin, that silence spoke louder than the mentions ever had. There were conversations between them during this time that felt layered in a way that was hard to name. One evening in late January, Kevin said, "I feel like we haven't really talked in a while." Julia looked up from her laptop. "We talk every day." "I don't mean about logistics," Kevin said. "I mean really talked." She held his gaze for a moment. "I'm tired, Kevin. Work has been a lot." "I know," he said. "I'm just saying I miss you." Something moved across her face. Not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it. A flicker of something she seemed to decide not to examine. "I'm right here," she said, and returned to her screen. He didn't push. He never pushed. That was one of his qualities and one of his failures. And he hadn't yet decided which it was more of. In February, Kevin went to a work conference for 4 days. He called Julia each evening. The conversations were fine, warm enough, normal enough. But on the third night, he asked what she'd been up to, and she was quiet for just a beat too long before saying, "Not much. Quiet around here." When he came home, the house smelled faintly of a candle he didn't recognize. He didn't say anything. There was a weekend in March when Julia's phone lit up at 2 in the morning. Kevin was awake. He'd always been a light sleeper. He didn't look at the screen. He just lay there in the dark, listening to his wife breathe beside him, watching the ceiling, and feeling something he hadn't let himself name begin to settle into the bones of his chest. He was not angry yet. He was something quieter than angry. He was grieving something he hadn't fully lost yet. And that, he would later think, was the strangest kind of pain. The anticipatory kind. The kind that understands what's coming before the mind is willing to say it out loud. The realization that arrived that March night was not dramatic. It was more like the last piece of a puzzle dropping into a shape he'd been trying not to see. He didn't want to believe it. But belief, he was learning, doesn't always wait for permission. Kevin chose a Sunday afternoon in April. He waited until the house was quiet and the light was good. Soft, late afternoon light that came through the living room windows and made everything look more gentle than it probably deserved. Julia was on the couch reading or pretending to. He sat across from her in the armchair and said her name. She looked up. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to be honest with me." He could see her posture change slightly. A small tightening. "Okay," she said. "What is happening with Daniel?" The pause was almost imperceptible. But Kevin was paying attention. He had been paying attention for months. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I mean," Kevin said carefully, "that I've watched something change in you since he came into your life. I'm not accusing you of anything specific. I'm asking you to tell me the truth about what's going on." Julia set her book down. She looked at the floor for a moment before looking at him. "Daniel is a colleague. He's a friend." "How close a friend?" Another pause. "We talk. We connect. He listens to me." She said the last part quietly, and Kevin heard what was underneath it. The implication that he did not, or not enough, or not in the right way. "Julia," Kevin said, "I want you to hear me. Not as an argument, just as a fact. I'm not okay with whatever this has become, and I need you to make a choice." He steadied his breath. Either you step back from him completely, honestly, and we figure out what we've lost and try to find it again, or you don't. But I can't keep living in this middle space. I won't. Julia looked at him for a long moment, and then, quietly, she laughed. It wasn't cruel exactly. It wasn't mocking. It was the laugh of someone who has decided that a situation doesn't quite merit full seriousness. Kevin, she said, you're not seriously giving me an ultimatum. I am, he said. You're being dramatic. He was quiet for a moment. Maybe, he said, but I'm serious. She shook her head slowly, the way you do with someone you've decided to be patient with. I'm going to go for a drive, she said. Let you cool down. She picked up her keys. She left. Kevin sat in the armchair for a while after the door closed. Then he stood, went upstairs, and began to pack. He didn't pack everything, just what he needed. His clothes, his books, his toiletries, the small framed photograph of his parents he kept on the nightstand. He moved quietly through the house. He wasn't angry. He was somewhere past anger, in the place where decisions live. He left his wedding ring on the kitchen counter, not as a gesture, just because it felt honest. He was gone before Julia returned. 2 hours later, Julia came home. She would later describe that moment to her sister in a voice that still carried something unprocessed in it. The way she opened the door and the house was different. Not messy, not disturbed, just emptied of something. A quality of silence that was not the same as quiet. She walked to the kitchen first, saw the ring. She stood there for a long time. In the weeks that followed, Julia cycled through several versions of the story she told herself. The first version was that Kevin had overreacted. He was sensitive, always had been. He built something in his head and let it grow into something it wasn't. She and Daniel were friends. They had never crossed a line, not a physical one. And if Kevin couldn't trust her enough to believe that, then maybe the problem wasn't Julia. Maybe the problem was Kevin. This version lasted about 3 weeks. The second version was softer and harder at the same time. She started to admit, privately, that she had allowed something to grow that she should have named sooner. The long conversations with Daniel, the way she lit up before his messages, the way she had started comparing, not consciously, but comparison has a way of happening whether you sanction it or not. She began to see that she had been feeding something she shouldn't have, even if she had not taken what many would call the final step. Daniel, for his part, grew distant once the situation lost its comfortable ambiguity. Julia noticed this with a clarity that was almost clinical. Without the marriage as a backdrop, without the secret texture that made their connection feel electric, things between them settled into something far more ordinary. He was a good colleague, a decent person, but whatever she had thought she had glimpsed in him had required a certain context to shine, and that context was gone. By June, she had stopped texting Daniel the way she used to. She moved through her days with a kind of careful functionality. She worked. She cooked for herself. She called her sister on Sundays. She redecorated the bedroom. New curtains, new throw pillows. The way people rearrange things when they are trying to rearrange themselves. Kevin, she heard through mutual connections, had moved into a place on the other side of the city. He was working. He seemed by all accounts to be doing quietly okay. She told herself this meant he was fine, that perhaps she had been right all along and he had simply moved on easily because his feelings had not run as deep as he'd made them seem. She found some temporary comfort in this interpretation. It required ignoring certain things, like the 6 years, like the coffee every morning, like the way he had said "I miss you" on that January evening, and meant it so plainly that the words had almost been too heavy to look at directly. By August, the self-deception was harder to maintain. She had started to understand something that took its time arriving. Kevin had not left impulsively. He had left after months of watching and hoping and quietly aching. He had given her the chance that April Sunday to choose something real. She had laughed, and that laugh, she now understood, had not been confidence. It had been a failure of imagination. She had not been able to imagine that he would actually go, The major turning point came one evening when she found an old voicemail she had never deleted, Kevin's voice. Left on a random Wednesday, probably a year ago. He was just calling to say he was on his way home and asking if she wanted anything from the store. His voice was so ordinary, so unguarded, so entirely without performance. She listened to it 3 times, then she sat with it, and the weight of what she had let slide through her hands became, for the first time, fully real. They met finally on a Thursday morning in September. Not by accident. Julia had reached out through a text, brief and careful, asking if he would be willing to talk. Kevin had replied after a day, yes. Coffee, maybe. Somewhere neutral. They met at a small cafe that neither of them had been to before. That detail was deliberate on both their parts, though neither said so. Kevin arrived first. He looked, Julia thought when she walked in, like himself, but settled in a way he hadn't been before, as if something that had been pulled slightly taut in him for years had finally been allowed to go still. They ordered. They made small talk about the weather, the neighborhood, whether the cafe was new or had always been there. The kind of conversation that fills space while 2 people gather themselves. Then Julia said, I owe you an apology. Kevin looked at her. He didn't say you don't or it's fine, the reflexive courtesies people offer to end discomfort. He just waited. I laughed, she said. When you gave me the ultimatum, I laughed and I walked out, and I thought. She paused. I thought you were performing. I thought you'd be there when I came back. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I didn't take you seriously, and I think I'd stopped taking you seriously for a while before that. Why? Kevin asked. It was a genuine question, not an accusation. She thought about it for a long moment. Because you were always there, she said. You were consistent, and somewhere along the way I confused consistent with permanent, with unconditional. She looked at him, as if your love didn't need anything from me to keep going. Kevin was quiet for a while. Outside, the September light moved through the windows in slow angles. I made it easy for you to make that mistake, he said finally. I kept my pain very quiet. I thought that was the mature thing to do. He turned his cup in his hands. I waited a long time hoping you would notice on your own. That wasn't fair either. You told me you missed me, Julia said. In January. I remember. I know. I went back to my laptop. He nodded. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Are you happy? Julia asked. The question was genuine, without any agenda behind it. She really wanted to know. Kevin considered it with the care he gave everything. I'm getting there, he said. I'm learning some things about myself that I probably should have learned earlier. He paused. I think I spent a long time trying to hold things together quietly, hoping that effort would be enough. It isn't always. Julia nodded. She understood. Not the way she might have understood the words intellectually 6 months ago, but fully, in her body. I don't think I want to undo it, Kevin said carefully. Not anymore. That's not what I'm saying. I wanted to see you. I wanted to know that I don't hate you, that I understand some of it now. Julia felt something in her chest shift. Not hope, exactly. Something quieter than hope. Something closer to release. Thank you, she said. They finished their coffee. They talked for another half-hour about smaller things. Her sister's new apartment, his current project at work, a book they had both apparently read in the months since April without knowing it. When they stood to leave, Kevin held the door for her, and she thanked him, and they stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the September air. Take care of yourself, he said. You too, she said, and then they walked in different directions. No embrace. No final tearful look over the shoulder. Just 2 people who had once been everything to each other, choosing to part with the same quiet dignity that Kevin had always possessed and that Julia was, slowly, learning. Some marriages end in storms, broken dishes and slammed doors and words that can never be taken back. And those endings have their own terrible honesty. But Kevin and Julia's ended in something softer and, in some ways, more devastating. It ended in a laugh that wasn't meant to wound but did, in a ring left on a kitchen counter, in a voicemail saved on a phone, in 2 cups of coffee, and the particular grace of 2 people telling each other the truth without needing anything in return. Kevin had once read somewhere that the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. He had believed that for years. But sitting across from Julia that September morning, he had understood something more precise. The opposite of love, he thought, is taking it for granted, assuming it will stay without being tended, choosing the exciting unknown over the steady, faithful, quietly extraordinary person sitting across from you at the breakfast table every morning. He didn't say that to her. Some things are understood better in silence. He walked back to his car, sat for a moment, and breathed. And then he drove forward, into the rest of it, into whatever came next. That, in the end, is all any of us can do.